All right, well, let's get started.
Great.
So thanks for joining us, Pastors Positive Mental Health Institute. As you can see, another fantastic guest, and I can say fantastic because he is fantastic, Dr. Chris Adams from Biola University. And I know that you had school within Biola, I think, and so I'll let you tell us about that in just a moment. But if you find this beneficial, please like and share it. You can check some things out at ppmhi.org, and I'll have areas for you to make comments and contact information also in the comment section. So I can't wait for you guys to hear from Dr. Chris Adams. So Chris, if you just take a moment to kind of introduce yourself, years of ministry, your official title, all the
Sure.
stuff that you do, and we'll just sit back and be blessed by what you have to share.
Sure. Well, thank you. Thank you for your kind introduction and opportunity to be with you and your listeners. I super excited when I first got your email just to see the title of what you're doing. So the Institute for Pastors Positive Mental Health is kind of speaking my language. So you had me right then and there at the title. I think we're very like-minded and similar hearts as I've gotten to know you. So it's really a privilege to be with you. I grew up as a pastor's kid, of a pastor's kid. So I'm third generation. And my grandfather was a pastor of mostly what I like to call small clergy killing kinds of congregations, at least for two-thirds of his ministry career anyway. And one of my heroes in ministry for sure. And he unfortunately died young of a heart attack. And I'm convinced that a lot of that had to do with ministry stress. People weren't researching this, and talking about the physiology of stress and the impact of that on clergy's physical health and mental health and all that stuff back in those days. But my dad's been in music ministry all of my life. And because of his various roles that he took on in different capacities, I found myself in lots and lots of pastors' homes across a real wide range of denominational traditions, really throughout my childhood, adolescence, into college years and beyond. Um, and that was a wonderful exposure to all the amazing people that are out there, being obedient to God's call on their lives and shepherding God's people and all that means, the joys of that and the stresses of that. And so saw a lot of great examples of different ministry approaches, and also heard a lot of common pain, I think, growing up from pastors and spouses and pastors' kids. And in retrospect, I think maybe the Lord was shaping something in me that would later become a part of the work that I do, that I know you do as well, on a daily basis as we journey with leaders and try to be an encouragement. And then I have a number of years in pastoral ministry myself as an associate pastor at a large church, and then in university chaplaincy for almost a decade. And through the course of that time, became more and more interested in clergy health kinds of things, and ended up studying at Fuller Seminary with a couple of mentors who had really been pioneers in studying the mental health of clergy. Dr. Archibald Hart, the late Dr. Hart, sort of primary among those, and ended up becoming a psychologist specializing in working with clergy and missionaries and their families, both on the research side and then also on how do we actually practically help people through counseling, coaching, leadership development, formation, all those kinds of things. So I've been at Biola for a year and a half now, and I am in Rosemead Graduate School of Psychology, which is one of the premier integration programs in the U.S., Christian psychology programs. And it's been a great fit because Rosemead has a long history of supporting pastors and missionaries through research and clinical work, and just enormous support from the university for the Flourishing in Ministry project, which I know we'll talk a little bit more about, that's ongoing. And yeah, it's a real joy. So I've got a great team here, a great group of doctoral students all doing research around these kinds of things. And it's a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, it's good to have fun. So you'd spent some years in pastoral ministry. So I'd just like to explore that a little bit. One of the things we find in the work that you've done, the work that I've done, is there's kind of this commonality about how people go into ministry and how that actually fuels what they do. And sometimes they have to draw from that because, again, pastors most of the time see it as a sacred call from God and sacred
You
work,
bet.
which makes them challenges. So just tell me about that journey a little bit for you.
Sure, yeah, happy to. So I think part of it, I can't ever remember a time in my life when I wasn't aware of believing in God and having a sense of God's presence in my life, which I'm really thankful for, even from early childhood. And having grown up in a ministry family, just had exposure, of course, to my grandfather and his stories and my dad's work. And we've got lots of other relatives and extended family that are theology professors, pastors, missionaries. And so I just kind of grew up around a lot of that, and I think was inspired by that. Saw some really healthy examples of that, thankfully, growing up. And remember distinctly being in church on a Sunday night. I grew up in Nashville most of my formative years, and we went to church like 4 times on Sunday. It seemed like back in those days, but it was an awesome church, so I loved going.
Nice.
And my senior pastor, who's still the iconic pastor in my heart and mind, and just such a formative relationship for me, preached a sermon on a Sunday night about the call to vocational ministry. And uh, at the end of the service, there was an invitation to pray at the altar, and I just had this incredibly powerful encounter with God speaking to me and nudging me that direction. So I went forward and prayed at the altar, and then he spent a good hour with me in his office with my parents after church, just talking with me about what I had just experienced. And he was affirming of that, took seriously that God would speak to a 12-year-old or a child, even younger, and affirmed that. And then he really nurtured that over the years. He would check in with me and kind of give me a little glimpses into what it was like to do what he did and that kind of thing. And then got into college at a Christian university and had great mentors there, and it just continued to be affirmed. So there was both kind of that lightning bolt moment, as well as a lot of nurturing around that from my parents. I think my parents were both excited and affirming, and also afraid for me to go into church ministry because they knew how difficult that can be and how painful. But they've been super supportive my entire life, which has been really a blessing, and just had a lot of great mentors by the grace of God that have really shaped me deeply. And one of the things that's been interesting to me on the research side, as we've done this flourishing in ministry research now for over a decade, is listening to lots and lots of call stories from pastors, from evangelical mainline tradition, Catholic priests, the whole gamut. And what we found is there really are kind of two main pathways for people to enter into vocational ministry. Both involve having a lightning bolt kind of moment, or defining moments, maybe several major events where they really felt God speaking to them, guiding them this direction. But the pastors that have just had that lightning bolt moment, excuse me, and have not had the rich formational process around that over an extended period of time, tend not to be flourishing as much as those that had both. And sometimes the folks that have had both were intentional about that, or the denomination that they are in is intentional about that formational process. And sometimes it was just sort of present by the grace of God in their lives in some way. And having both those really defining moments when people really know that they know that they know that that's God leading them into this work, as well as a process around that, seemed to be key to flourishing long term.
Well, for sure. And what's interesting is, by the way, best testimony ever is what you just shared. As I grew up just knowing that God was real. I grew up in the church. Often we look for these, especially with some traditions I've been involved in. We're looking for this. Oh, I was, on the streets and
Yeah,
God sent an angel, which is great. I love those stories too. But I
yeah,
always find it refreshing when I hear, yeah, I was raised in the church. And I find, as me who has been raised in the church, and I'm a generational servant in the church. My grandfather, I grew up with my grandfather leading music in the church, and
awesome.
my great grandmothers and grandfathers were both pastors, and I find
Wow.
it very beneficial. And my brother's a pastor, so anyway, I guess we didn't have anything better to do. No, I'm just kidding. But I find it interesting to similar to what your story is how good that is for us to understand church culture, because the
Yeah,
organization of the church, though it is an organization, doesn't function like a secular organization
that's right.
as much as we try to make it. But at times,
Yeah,
because you're dealing with spiritual matters and
that's right.
the real intimate part of people's lives. I
That's
mean,
right.
you can talk to them about anything else. You start talking about their spiritual lives, and now you're treading a
You bet.
dangerous ground. And so I find that fantastic. And so tell us a little bit more about this flourishing ministry. I love the work that you're doing there, but I think that I want more people to know. So tell me a little bit about it.
Well, thank you for that opportunity. And just to piggyback on what you were just saying, I really am convinced churches operate more like a family system than any other sort of public institution or entity. And part of that's because we use familial language,
Mhm.
father and son, referring to the Trinity, of course, and then brother and sister in Christ. And it just kind of evokes kind of family systems types of dynamics that are always kind of at work. And one of the most helpful things I think for me as a pastor actually was learning some basic systems theory kinds of things, just to understand the emotional processes and relational processes that are really the undercurrent of what's going on in a lot of churches, or maybe all churches. And when there's conflict, people point to all the wrong things. It's not really about the thing people think it's about. It's about some historical thing or underlying anxiety or other all kinds of things. So that has really led us to think more about ecosystem care and ecosystem health in the Flourishing in Ministry project. I'm actually kind of moving away from self-care language for individual clergy. Not that that's not important, but it kind of implies that that's all that needs to happen. And it's sort of all on the pastor to somehow, manufacture a healthy congregation. Certainly healthy leadership is vital to that, but it's more than that. There's more that needs to happen there in the environment and the ecosystem. There are best practices, things we can point to that church boards, ministry teams, denominational leaders can do to set the kinds of conditions within which a leader can flourish. And so we're focusing more on that. But this project is over a decade old and was started by a good friend of mine, Dr. Matt Bloom, and I'm very indebted to him and his work, who was a researcher at the University of Notre Dame, and he had studied well-being at work and helping professions for about 20 years, with the hope that we could help people, the people helpers, help them flourish and last longer in their work, and maybe learn things from people that are in really intense, complicated people helping jobs like pastors, and yet seem to be flourishing somehow, even in the midst of all the complexities and stresses and strains. What can we learn from those people that can help all helping professions and then also help everybody with well-being at work in a more general kind of way? And Matt's wife, Kim, who's wonderful, is a Methodist pastor, has been in a variety of roles her entire career. And so he's lived life as a clergy spouse and had that unique perspective as well, and decided to focus on studying clergy. And that started over 10 years ago. We've got somewhere north of 20,000 clergy currently in the database and growing, and hundreds and hundreds of in-depth interviews as well, and have developed several things out of that. One is a Flourishing in Ministry app, and we're currently in the process of developing and launching the 2.0 version of the app. So some of your listeners may have been familiar with the original one, and then the new one will be coming out here in 2024 fairly soon. And the research is still ongoing, but we've also developed a Flourishing in Ministry coaching program. So we have a coaching certification that is a training people can go through that is accredited by the International Coaching Federation, which is kind of the gold standard in the coaching world for best practice and coaching competencies that are based on research and so forth. And then we also have a network of people that have been through our training. So a network of Flourishing in Ministry coaches that can provide individual and or group coaching to ministry leaders to come alongside them. And it's more focused on holistic formation and well-being and how that connects to effective leadership than it is developing pastoral skill per se. There's a lot of really great coaching out there for specific kinds of skill development and leadership, and that's important and needed. We're more focusing on well-being and formation in a holistic way. And that sometimes gets neglected in the busyness of ministry, or often gets neglected, even in seminary training.
Yeah.
And yet we find that it's the emotional and social stresses that are what lead to people leaving ministry prematurely or having other kinds of struggles that impair their effectiveness. And so we're trying to do preventative work, and sort of go upstream from the crises if we can.
Yeah, that's really, one of the things that I try to do is, people ask me, yeah, I was approached by an insurance company, a Christian insurance
Mm,
company, and we started talking, and though I love to partner with them, they're looking at crisis management, like the pastor's completely burnt out,
right.
and I said, really my work is, after they start getting to health, then we can start putting in some preventative measures. But I'm like, how do we get this into the hands
Yes,
of church leadership, and congregations before that happens? And
that's
I think
right.
that's what kind of your direction is. How do we do
Yes.
this? And then Dr. Greg Walton, who I interviewed a few weeks ago, is from Grace Place Wellness, and therefore the
Mm-hmm.
LCMS Church, and that's what they're starting to shift to really look
That's
how do we
great.
get preventative. And I think the awareness is something that's interesting. So if you say, you're from a psychology department, and sometimes we can find some pushback on that, and so I'd like
Sure, of course.
speak a minute about that, because in the presentations that I've done, I definitely see this difference in demographic of age group of receptiveness.
Uh-huh.
You were using words like well-being, resilience, and you were even used the word psychology. And I find that when we talk about mental health, and
Yeah.
I like that you're shifting from self-care. I've kind of adopted a model of steward care just for the mind of the pastor,
Yeah.
giving us something to steward, and it's easier
Yeah.
for us to kind of almost, I don't want to separate ourselves from ourselves, but self-care is hard for pastors because
Yes.
we feel guilty that we're taking time
Yeah.
away from the congregation.
It,
So anyway,
yeah. No, I like that stewardship lens a lot. I've used that too, because it self-care can kind of unintentionally connote self-indulgence or being selfish or self-centered. And we're not talking about that. What we are talking about is stewardship of the greatest tool God's given people for ministry, which is them, themselves. And how do we steward that? So taking care of yourself is actually doing something for the sake of the
right.
work, the mission, and the kingdom work that God's called you to. So anyway, but just preaching to the choir, but love
No, but
love
that's
that
good
love
because
that shift, because I
yeah.
think it's a really helpful one.
Well, we're supposed to, Ephesians 4, build one another up in love.
Yeah,
And
amen.
I think that, that includes, leadership saying, hey, pastor, are you, I golf with a pastor during the summer, and he's 77 or whatever, and still
I love that.
pastoring, and,
Oh, I
and,
love
uh,
that.
and and he's like, man, I got to do this more. And we're in his hometown, and I said, well, why don't you just go in the mornings or something? Don't go to the office till like 10 or 11. He goes, well, I want to be available. And it's a small church. I'm like, is your cell phone on? I mean, I've heard him
Yeah,
take calls, and I said, you're 5 minutes from the church on the golf course. Just do it,
yeah,
but we feel
yeah.
guilty because
Right.
we see it, like you said, as self-indulgence, and
That's right.
and shirking our responsibility. We just go sit in the office and twiddle our thumbs, maybe. But anyway,
Right.
so again, how would you address someone who are those different demographics that
Yeah.
struggle with psychology, in the church anyway?
No, it's a great question. And one of the things, just to specifically piggyback on what you were just saying, that I find that church boards don't often understand, and even pastors themselves haven't maybe thought about all the implications of, is what we call role immersion, which is being in a role 24/7. And pastors are very unique in that way. There maybe are some other helping professions that approximate it, like maybe family physician when they're on call, maybe social worker in some ways. But it's very unique to be related to as your role 24/7, and at least in other people's minds, be available 24/7, and be omnipresent, like God or something, or omniscient or always available. Um, and so thinking through the implications of that, even just for stress management, is often something that's off the radar, under the radar, and that's where we see a lot of the issues show up. And so that's where psychology can be helpful, I think, in giving us some insight into what it means to be human. How did God design us and create us? And what are the practices that we know will boost well-being if we practice them on a regular basis? And what's fascinating to me is that currently in the movement in social science known as positive psychology, which is sort of studying what's right with healthy people, and in our case, healthy leaders. Many of the practices that research is affirming are ancient Christian spiritual practices. They're not new to the Christian faith, even if science is quote unquote discovering them. They're not really new practices. So, for example, things like silence, solitude, gratitude practices, there are many, many things that have been a part of the Christian faith for centuries that are help human beings flourish, as it turns out. And so when we look at that conversation between faith and psychology, I think one of the things that I always like to say, first of all, my pastoral identity is more important to me than my psychologist identity. And so I really want to start from a pastoral place, what's going to be edifying to the church for the sake of the world, for the sake of God's mission in the world. And there's a lot to be skeptical of in psychology. So I think the people that push back on it actually have a really valid point, and we don't want to take any given psychological theory wholesale without thinking about it critically. Where does it resonate with biblical principles and Christian theology, and where does it not? And not adopt psychology as our primary worldview or system of meaning making, but do what is called theology directed integration, which is where we're starting with scripture and theology and church history, and we're rounding out our understanding of some things with psychology and social science, but not letting psychology become the religion, if you will.
Mhm.
And that takes a nuanced, in some ways, complex conversation, but it's a very fruitful one in my experience.
Yeah. I kind of look at it as, the physicians. There are good physicians and bad physicians. There's some
Yeah,
that promote certain practices that maybe isn't the most beneficial, but yet if you got a broken leg, you're going to the doctor,
yeah,
and so
yeah.
I
Well,
think it's kind of important.
well, and the other piece with that, and this is what I talk a lot with graduate students about, is if you look at integration of psychology and theology is in some ways maybe not even the right word, because that assumes you're integrating two totally separate things. But if you look at a lot of psychological theories, they have a lot of implicit Judeo-Christian ethics and ideas and principles in them. And many of the great theorists actually had faith background of some kind, and some were even pastors' kids. And then on the biblical side, there is implicit psychology in scripture in different places. And so we're really recapturing something that maybe was already integrated
Right.
uh, centuries ago,
Sure.
and thinking about it in more contemporary terms in some ways. Um, but yeah, so to those who would push back, I say point well taken.
Yeah.
Um, but let's think about how we observe Jesus interact with people. There's an awful lot in Pauline epistles that could be considered a biblical psychology in some ways. So there's a lot for us to think about there.
Yeah, and because you mentioned isolation is such a big challenge for pastors,
Yeah,
usually caused by hurts or maybe
yeah,
a skewed view of the call. But especially those who have been, in it for a long time, and they've been dealing with congregations like you talked about, congregation or killers, clergy killers, and
yeah,
congregations that, I think that the pushback I get often is, well, Jesus is supposed to be enough. And I said, yeah, but Jesus gave you a family of believers
right,
that you can see Jesus in. And
right.
so we don't want to
That's right.
discount that he's using people, because that's how he does things
That's
to
right.
build one another up. And the challenge that a lot of pastors have, as you talk about the pastoral identity 24/7, is another thing that we struggle with is the ambiguous job expectations.
Yeah,
And nobody realized those expectations are there until you fail to meet those
that's
expectations.
right.
and then they realize it's an expectation. Then I find people struggle with the fact that it's an expectation, and if they would pause and really think about it, they would realize it's an unfair expectation.
Right.
And so, because you'd never say in the job description, this is what I expect you to do.
Right.
And when you don't do it, they're like, oh, you're not doing
Yeah.
it. So
You didn't do it like the last pastor did it. Yeah.
right, right.
Yeah.
No, exactly. Or yeah, there's just a lot of I have a friend that says calls it territorial boundaries that you don't know until
Yeah.
you're stepping in them, right? And then you're
That's
like,
right. That's exactly right.
I think sometimes the church member doesn't know that they're there either until
Right. I
somebody
agree.
messes in it.
Yeah.
So, what are some of the challenges in all your research and your experience that you see facing pastors, just maybe more currently than
Yeah. Well, certainly what you're talking about is one which is the role complexity, and got all the expectations from people, both written and spoken, and unwritten and unspoken, and the research that's been done on that role complexity suggests that it is perhaps the most complex job description a person could ever try to fill, because of the range of competencies that are needed. Be nice to be an expert in so many different areas, and then what are called the switching costs, which is switching rapidly between those in any given day. So from facilities management to pastoral counseling to sermon prep to financial management to board meeting to hospital visitation before you go home that night. And that's just Monday, for
right,
example.
right,
And there are just very few jobs that require that of a person. And so what we're finding is that one of the ways to cope with that is to think about strengths and passions, and gifts, and try to do what we call job crafting around those things at least 60% of the time over the course of, say, a year. So there are always going to be those days or even weeks when you're doing things totally outside of your sweet spot, so to speak, that you never imagined you'd ever have to do. Nobody in seminary ever told you were going to have to do this, and yet there you are doing it. And there are those days or seasons, but over the course of time, if we can keep it at 60% or more, that seems to be a threshold that is helpful to people. If it gets too far below that for too long, people disengage from their work more quickly, burn out more quickly, that kind of thing. We're also finding that ending on a high note is really helpful. So going back to one of the things that brings you the most joy in ministry for at least 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the workday, even if that's at 10 o'clock at night or whenever it is, can be really helpful as a daily practice. There's a positive accumulation to those daily practices when we're consistent with small steps. That really makes a big difference in the long term toward preventing burnout and promoting flourishing. To just stay in touch with the joy, even after the day when it was really difficult or that was not joy filled. Ending the day with joy is a really helpful practice we're finding.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, and I know you're familiar with the Barna statistics, and sometimes they are well, you can read them through certain lenses. We'll just put it that way. But what we have seen, especially since COVID, is an increased number of pastors that are considering
yeah,
leaving the ministry. Now, some of the challenges, even in thinking about that for a lot of pastors, is they can't put pastor for 20 years on a resume and have companies, fighting
right.
to hire them.
Yeah,
I find with the younger generation, I say under 30, they're like, oh, I can start over, I can reinvent myself. So I think it's easier for them. But for some
yeah,
of us old guys, it's like, well, this is what I do. This is
right,
what I love to do, but
right.
so I might think about quitting, but I don't. So now you find pastors that are stuck,
Yes,
which isn't healthy either. And
yes.
so, but what do you think is some of the main causes of this shift that we seem?
Yeah. So, and back to that very important question. So I think beyond the role complexity, the conflict in church
Mm,
nowadays is, at least in my lifetime in the United States, is beyond anything that I think I've ever seen. It's always been there, of course, but it just seems like during and after COVID, it's been ratcheted up exponentially. And what our research tells us is it's being treated with contempt by people. That is the most difficult when things are so polarized politically in North America right now. And here we go, headed into another presidential election cycle. And most every pastor I talk to is just dreading that because they're already exhausted from the conflict from COVID, and feeling like they can't win no matter what they do or don't do, say or don't say. People are upset, and out of that being upset, will just treat a pastor with just vitriolic kinds of even abusive language or tactics of some kind that are really challenging and really hurtful, especially when it's people that you have been there for in the past, have gone the extra mile for, have shepherded, built relationships with, you thought, until you're on the receiving end of that behavior. And it's just really, really painful. Even I'm convinced, actually, Kirk, that there's a form of post-traumatic stress that clergy experience from really, really chronic and uh, sort of gnarly church conflict and abusive behavior toward them.
Yeah, I just started initially doing some research on post-traumatic stress and clergy, and there's a little bit out there right now
Yeah.
about it, and it's significant. I'm
Hmm.
quite shocked at some of the initial research. I mean, it's with up there with veterans who had actually experienced
Yes,
combat,
that's right. That's right.
and it's pretty. With all my extra time, because I have some other ideas that I want to
Yeah.
do, But yeah, and so here we have this contempt idea, and yeah, I see that, and it's almost like we go from 0 to 10 very quickly now in
Yes.
escalation of
So true.
conflict, which wasn't before. We're in a world with all the social media where everything is reaction driven, and not necessarily response driven because we
That's right.
react to a soundbite
Hmm.
without knowing everything, and it seems to be acceptable now, and
Yes.
nobody fact checks really anymore, and
Right.
so we find this challenge. How can church members help pastors with this culture that seems to be prevalent in our churches?
Yeah. Great question. And I was going to mention too, I think one of the reasons I think we see the post-traumatic stress in clergy uh, at a similar rate in some studies to veterans is that the what gets triggered in our brain, in our what's called our amygdala, which is the part of our brain that has our stress response system, that is a gift, but it can get triggered whenever there's a sense of safety that is compromised, and certainly a physical threat to our safety or life-threatening sort of situation, but relational safety can also trigger that. And I think that's more often the case. It depends on the context. People in urban ministry get a lot of exposure to violent crime and those kinds of things, and that can be really challenging. But um, so part of what I think congregations can do is learn to develop empathy for your pastor, not see them as, a victim or something like that, but just understand the complexity and layers to the emotional and relational work that they do, that is really daunting for anybody, no matter who you are. But also uh, share the load, particularly when it comes to conflict in the church. So, healthier congregations that I know about have set processes in place for church conflict, for grievances from parishioners and/or staff. And if there's somebody who's exhibiting, bullying behavior in a church, then they will not just set the pastor up to be the one to have to always deal with that, but the system will deal with it. It's sort of analogous to the immune system in the body. When it's healthy, it will surround infection
Hmm. Hmm.
and heal it or get rid of it somehow. And it doesn't have to be the pastor who always does that. I'll give you a quick example. A friend of mine is a pastor of a large church in Southern California, and there was a wealthy member who was upset about something, and so he called and demanded to meet with the senior pastor. So the senior pastor met with him again, met with them, I think up to 5 or 6 times. And every time they met, the issue changed. He could never really nail down what was really the core issue here. It just seemed to always change. And so finally, his elder board said to him, Pastor, you've done more than enough. Thank you for trying to care about this guy, but you don't need to meet with him any longer. We will take it from here, and we will run interference for you because we trust you and believe in you, and you've tried to work through this with a reasonable amount of time. So we will now handle that for you. You don't have to meet with him anymore. And that's a healthy church that would understand that. And not that the pastor doesn't have responsibility themselves to respond and not react, because of course they do, but how can we buffer some of the conflict, at least the conflict that's unreasonable, out of bounds, toxic, abusive,
Right.
and just not tolerate that from one another, really in love. I mean, in Christian community, to be accountable to one another for our behavior.
Yeah, and I think that that's one thing pastors look for too, in some of the research that I had done is that even if there is conflict, if people are reasonable,
Yes.
that's helpful because I mean, we live in conflict, and it's interesting using the body metaphor. Paul uses that in his
Mm,
writings, and when one member rejoices, we rejoice. When one member mourns, we mourn, and
yeah.
and I think sometimes we put the pastor outside of that body as churches, and
Mm,
everything becomes very unilateral to where
yes.
we just come. And I think I've shared this before, but and it's probably not the right analogy, but I often feel like as pastors, people come into your office and they spiritually vomit on you, and then you walk out smelling like that, right? And you
Yeah.
take it home, and they might feel better, but they probably won't do what your suggestion is anyway. Well,
Yeah.
sometimes, but the whole
Yeah.
point with that is having somebody say, this is a really key thing. That empathy point is so good. Hey, Pastor, I know that you're seems stressful right now. I just want you to know I know that. Just saying that is a huge,
Yes, you bet.
and whether they can help or not is not the issue, but that helps tremendously. Just recognizing the pastor, we had a suicide a few years ago,
Oh, I'm
young
sorry.
man in our
Mm,
church, and I was so blessed the number of texts I got from a couple people throughout the next few weeks, just saying, "Hey, we just want to make sure you're doing okay. We're praying for you."
wow.
Just them recognizing
Yeah.
that, it was huge, just
Yeah.
huge for me. And so I think that it's one of those things. And so my study and my work, and then the little book that I wrote, very simple. I mean, it's not rocket science. I always say pastors aren't very complicated people because we're extremely insecure. So it doesn't take much, right? So
Yeah.
so
Oh, you're
anyway,
right. I mean, you
yeah.
maybe what prompted a memory I've thought of in a long time was my pastor from in my childhood, who I just adore. Um, I remember a sermon he preached toward the end of his time, as he was headed toward the college presidency, and he said to the congregation, in love, I've been here for almost 20 years, and been in the office for every conceivable kind of crisis you can imagine, and or complaint about every conceivable thing in the church, over those 20 years. He said, I realize I can't remember a single time when someone just stopped by to confess the goodness of God in their lives, and how grateful they were for this Christian community and that kind of thing. And I mean, you could hear an audible gasp, because everybody felt badly about that. And he wasn't trying to make everybody feel guilty. He was just saying, let's also share the positive stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
And so doing that for your pastor when there are wonderful things happening in your life as a believer, because of involvement in Christian community, whether the pastor is directly or indirectly responsible for that, doesn't matter. Just encourage them, send them those notes, especially when difficult seasons are happening. And just to rejoice in the Lord together can be a really huge boost.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is, again, pastors try to do things to make eternal ramifications, right? Everything we
That's
do
right.
is based upon, I want to see you in heaven. I
That's
want to
right.
see your friends in heaven, your loved ones in heaven. I want to see you be, to use quote, successful in
Yeah.
your Christian life, or victorious in your Christian
Yeah.
life, and I want you to trust Jesus more. And if you never hear that people are actually doing that,
That's
it
right.
can be very, very discouraging. It's one of those things, even when we have, in our church, we say prayers for people that are in
Hmm.
our bulletin all the time.
Yes, of course.
And sometimes you seem like you're praying for these people for months, and you have no idea what's going on. And so when you find that report, hey, they're doing well now, they don't need to be on the prayer report anymore.
Yeah.
Just making sure that we tell people and rejoice, hey, your
Yes.
prayers work.
Yeah.
And so it works the same with pastors, hey, thank
You
you for
bet.
your work. you know
Yeah. If
um,
you stop by to spiritually vomit in a crisis, then please circle back and let us know you're doing better. Yeah, absolutely.
Circle
Yeah.
back with some
The
OxyClean. Anyway, sorry, no.
That's right. That's right. The other thing I was thinking about in this conversation that I think churches can do, I'm amazed at how many churches have, pastoral staff and other staff, none of whom actually have a written job description. And you can go too far in that direction where it feels like you're, in a very corporate kind of model. And as you mentioned before, the church is a different thing qualitatively altogether. However, having some kind of covenantal understanding about what's God calling this particular congregation to in this season, what are the priorities as a church, how do the strength-based job descriptions, how should the pastor be emphasizing their time, what should they be doing with most of their time, and then we put people around that, volunteers, other paid staff who have complementary strengths, and have some kind of agreed upon covenant among leadership. It can be really helpful because then when somebody comes and complains to me, well, why aren't you doing A, B, and C? Well, here we've got this whole strategic plan, where we've decided together that I'm not going to emphasize that. And that's why we have this other person doing that. And doesn't mean all the criticism goes away, certainly, but
Right.
it's helpful to have a shared understanding of what are the priorities.
Yeah, and especially multi-staff church organizations, it's good to have clear lanes defined,
Yeah.
and that's good for the staff member too.
Yes.
So that they're not, because again, I mean, we get pulled every which way. They need to have a class in seminary on plumbing and electricity,
That's
and
right.
other things, and
You really
landscape.
should. No, you're absolutely right.
It was just
Yeah.
a few weeks ago. It's funny. I get this email. I guess it was Sunday morning. I don't, it was either late Saturday night or Sunday morning, saying, "Hey, just so you know, it was really cold in the sanctuary, and it was like 20 degrees outside." And so I'm like, "Okay," and we have a properties committee, but I'm the one that
Sure.
gets,
Of course.
and it was funny because I'm like, "Okay, Lord, I don't know," but I walk in and the batteries just need to be changed on the
Yeah.
thermostat. And I'm like, so I look like a hero. It was wonderful. And I
Right,
hadn't
right.
been
Yeah.
preached yet. So it was good. So,
Man, if everything were that easy to
yeah,
to
yeah, I was like,
address,
oh,
right?
thank you,
But
Lord. It's like whenever something happened on the soundboard when I was doing music ministry for years and the sound guy would call me back, I'm like, okay, I know maybe a little more than the sound
yep,
guy, but not. And
yep.
so, oh, it's just this button.
Well,
Great.
and you know what that makes me think of, Kirk, is in the research I've been a part of now, stumbled across an occupational stress theory. So there are psychologists, social scientists who just study job stress kind of in general, across lots of different kinds of jobs. And one of the theories that I came across is called demand control theory, which basically says this: if you have certain kinds of high demands in certain kinds of ways in a job, all of which map onto pastoral ministry, I think, really well. So long hours, lots of different areas of expertise. You're switching rapidly in between, like we talked about, um, all kinds of hidden expectations, and just kind of goes down the list. And then you have low control in certain kinds of ways. Also, many of which map well onto pastoral ministry. It's a recipe for certain kinds of stress-related physical health issues and burnout and depression. And I think it's just funny to me how sometimes people have this perception that pastors control everything. That you have this pastoral Harry Potter wand, and you can control everything from the weather to, I don't know, you name it.
Yeah,
And so the demands are high, but actually what you can actually control is actually pretty low,
really low. Yeah.
really.
Yeah.
And it's in some ways, unless we kind of address both sides of that to some extent, with boundaries on the demand side and maybe with theological perspective and some other things on the control side, it's a recipe for a really tough job.
Yeah. And one thing that I think that is important for pastors to know, I've learned what I think is the art of saying, I don't know, it's not my skill set. And being okay with that.
Yeah,
You're going to have to, somebody else has to step up because I don't know how to fix this. Now, if I
yeah,
can, I'm going to fix it. But I know I've become keenly aware of my limitations with certain things.
yes,
I'm not real
yeah,
handy with a hammer.
yeah.
So, I can hit things, but it's not always going to be what you want
And
hit. So,
and that's really a key thing. cultivating that self-acceptance that you're describing there, where I've sort of come to terms with, here's what I'm really gifted in and strong in, here's what I'm not very good at, and I've taken some proactive steps to make sure that out of my less developed areas, no harm is done, or it doesn't undermine the mission of our congregational life together, that sort of thing. Do you mind if I share a quick story about that comes to mind? So when I was in seminary, I was brand new on a pastoral staff, and like in my first month or something, so really, really green, if you will, in the role, and had an incredible mentor who's still a dear friend of mine, married my wife and I, and he'd been at this church for about 20 years as the executive pastor. And it was a Sunday morning. We just had this phenomenal worship service, amazing time, that you just pray for and kind of beyond your hopes, for a time like that. And we're kind of basking in the joy of that after the service is over, standing in front of the sanctuary talking. And this lady from the church came up, and she was one of the older adults there who came with the building, as they say. She'd been there forever, as long as anybody could remember. And she came up and just started to lay into him and just, really be hypercritical. And I felt myself getting angry. And I think my face probably even got flushed. And I was ready to like tangle with this lady. Like, you want to fight? Let's dance, kind of a thing. And I look over at my mentor, and he's totally unanxious, calm. He just let her go. And at some point he said, is that all? And there was more. So she kind of went a little bit longer and spilled some of that. And he said to her, I want to thank you for your obvious care for this church. You're as passionate as you are. It's obvious to me you care deeply. And I want you to know we have that in common. I love this place. I've given the best years of my life to this community. So we both love this place. And you're absolutely right. I'm not good at A, B, and C. I wish I was too. Never been my gifts. That's why we have Pastor Chris and these other staff and lay leaders in place. And here's where I'm accountable to growing in those areas and these relationships in my life. I'd like for you to pray for me that I'll continue to grow.
Hmm.
And she didn't know what to do with that. Totally disarmed her.
Yeah.
And then at some point in the conversation, he said, and I also need to say, some of what you have shared, I don't think is mine to own. And I need to ask that you never speak to me that way again, because it was disrespectful and hurtful. But I'd like to help you understand why you are speaking to me that way. And it ended up in a pastoral counseling kind of conversation, and I think a referral to counseling and medication in that particular situation, as I recall, which was an appropriate thing. Masterfully handled. Then we went to lunch, and I'm like still ticked for like the next hour and a half, and
Sure.
he was free.
Yeah.
Because he had done his own work over the years in spiritual direction and his own therapy, and he knew himself well and had come to accept himself.
Hmm.
And it took a lot of the power out of the criticism when he could say, we've already thought all that through.
Right. Well, and what's nice about what you share about that, because I don't want any pastors who listen to this to go, well, that's how I have to be. He didn't do that. He didn't get there overnight.
Right.
It took some time to get there because, like I said,
That's exactly right. It's a process.
Yeah, I have this pastor friend that says again that pastors are the most insecure people. And so when people come at you like that, inwardly you're like, I totally agree with you. I already feel bad about this. And so now you're just making it feel worse. And and being able to recognize like this man did that, yeah, you're right. I've known that for a while, and I've learned that I'm okay with that, and I don't have to be everything. So that's great. So what kind of wrapping things up here? I mean, I think you've given us so much valuable stuff, and we could probably talk stories for a long time.
Absolutely.
Right? But in your experience, both, in the ministry, but also especially as your expertise, because I find you to be, and I don't know if anybody else, but when I was doing my research, 4 or 5 years ago for my dissertation, your name and Dr. Ray Jean Preshrell Bell from Duke Clergy Health Initiative seem to find their way a lot in articles and mentions. And so I kind of look at so if anybody doesn't know Dr. Chris Adams, I consider him one of the leaders in our nation in pastor mental health and care. So anyway, I'm not trying to blow smoke up anything. I just it's it's one of those things that I want in the preface to this question. We're not asking somebody who doesn't know a whole lot. We're asking somebody who actually studied this and lived it, which I think is very valuable.
Mhm.
What are some tips that you might have? And you kind of mentioned one earlier, doing the thing that gives you joy at the end of the day.
Yeah.
What are some tips to help pastors with their positive mental health?
Yeah, great. So I think the thing that we're finding in sort of the face of a lot of the contemptuous, what one author calls presumptive criticism, which is, I know better than you do, Pastor, how to do your job, and I'm going to feel enormous freedom to tell you that and everybody else for some reason. Um, what what we believe to be true from the research is that cultivating self-awareness and kind of emotional self-regulation kinds of competencies, very similar, if not identical, to the concept of emotional intelligence, if your readers are familiar with that. So
Yeah,
we've talked for decades about IQ, but there's now conversation about what's called EQ,
yeah, yeah.
which really is based on growing self-awareness. That I'm aware of what I'm doing, thinking, and feeling, and what impact that is having on me and other people. If any of your listeners have ever seen a Christian leader with very little self-awareness and yet in a position of power in a faith community, that tends to not go very well over time. So cultivating that self-awareness, and then out of that, being able to reflect on what am I carrying, what's getting activated in me, and why, and let me then respond instead of react with self-control, which of course is a fruit of the Spirit we're created for. And we can all grow. We all maybe start in a different point in that based on genetics and our family of origin formation and lots of things. But we can all grow and be intentional about cultivating that self-awareness is a really significant thing. The other one I might say is, we mentioned this at the very beginning, it is important to play and have fun. It's important to have what a friend of mine calls holy detachment. And I love that phrase. She's a
I like
spiritual
that.
director.
Yeah.
And what we found is that a minimum of 20 minutes a week doing something that meets these three criteria is can be really a helpful practice that you enjoy doing just for the sheer enjoyment of the activity. It's playful. You have some skill in doing it, and it can be developing skill, but something that you've got some mastery over, and that takes your full concentration to do it. And that's the big one, because what is so often the case for many of us, I would include myself in this, is we can be practicing Sabbath or taking our time off, but we're still working in our head.
Yeah.
The sermon's always percolating
Mhm.
back there. I'm preaching next week at a chapel here, and I realized last night as I'm watching TV and taking downtime, quote unquote, I was actually doing sermon prep, in the back of my mind. And so to do something that takes your full attention means we take a mental break as well as a physical break from ministry work. And what we know from the research on occupational health is that when we do take a break like that, we come back to the same work with exponentially higher creativity, productivity, efficiency than if we hadn't detached.
Yeah.
And so it actually is doing something for the effectiveness of that sermon and all the other responsibilities pastors have to take a break and allow ourselves to be renewed in some way. So having a hobby, play, a restorative niche is what some authors call that, is a really, really important practice.
Well, that's good. Self-control. Yes, it's a fruit of the spirit. It's also one of the components of positive mental health, how
Yeah,
one regulates their emotions. And so it's always fun when science actually supports what the Bible has already told
that's
us.
right. That's exactly right.
Right.
Almost as if God created us and knows how we work,
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, Chris, thank you so much. I just appreciate your time. Just beneficial stuff. If you haven't checked out Flourishing in Ministry, please do so. It's just flourishinginministry.org. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yep. Yeah. Please check out our downloadable resources and
Yep.
all kinds of things there.
And if you haven't downloaded the app, do so. It's great. I'm looking forward to the 2.0 version. It's always better, right?
That's right. That's right.
Anyway, so again, if you find this beneficial, please like and share and subscribe. Also, contact information will be in the comments, also the website to Flourishing in Ministry, so you can check it out for yourself. But again, together we can build one another up in love and help the church flourish. Thanks, Chris.
Amen. Thank you.